Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. In our previous signpost, we looked at the dramatic encounter between Moses and God, and we focused on three truths from that encounter, namely that God sees, God calls, and God saves. In today's signpost, I want to consider just one more verse from Exodus that teaches another really crucial truth about God, a truth that will become increasingly evident as the story of the Bible unfolds, that God alone is God and he demands our exclusive loyalty. So I want to read just one verse from Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. Living in the UK today, you don't have to be a genius to know that the UK is in a mess. The economy is one of the worst performing of the developed nations. Gas and electricity and food prices are the highest they've ever been. Over 5 million people depend on food banks just to survive. And interest rates keep climbing, leaving many homeowners wondering how they're going to be able, if they're going to be able to keep up their mortgage payments. Over the past year, there have been more strikes than at any time since the early 1970s. Underfunding has left the NHS struggling to keep going, and crops are rotting in the fields because there's no one to harvest them. Politicians and pundits argue all day long about the causes of this crisis, but no one actually questions that we are in the midst of a social, economic, and political crisis. It's quite easy to see the social and economic decline of the UK, but what is perhaps less obvious is that underlying many of the structural problems in the UK today, there has been a corresponding moral crisis at the heart of our society. Political and economic corruption, greed and self-serving interests are not issues merely of policy or law. They're also fundamentally moral issues. The person who breaks the law through corruption, there's a moral issue going on in their lives that makes them feel that that's an okay thing to do. From a Christian perspective, the moral framework of our society has steadily degraded as many of the philosophical ideas born out of the Enlightenment period have gradually reshaped the morality of Western societies. Philosopher Charles Taylor suggests that prior ages were characterized by what he calls a transcendent frame, the idea that there was a sacred reality that transcended our material existence. In other words, in prior ages, almost universally, people believed that God existed, and that belief shaped society. In the ancient world, it was always understood that belief in God brought with it a corresponding moral framework for the good ordering of society. In contrast, our own age rejects the very idea of a sacred order and instead holds increasingly to the idea that there is no moral authority that transcends ourselves. In other words, God has become unnecessary in the modern world. We no longer live under the authority and rule of God because the very concept of God, or any God, has become redundant in the modern world. In Christian terms, we might say that Western societies that were once rooted in and shaped by the moral vision of the Bible have now cast off that moral vision. Behaviour that was unthinkable just 50 years ago is now not only normalised, but is often enshrined in law, and to criticise it is to be accused of being a bigot. The Ten Commandments provided the foundational moral order for what would become Israelite society, and both Jews and Christians would suggest they provide the only basis for a truly moral society. The very kind of society that people often say they want to live in, actually. So although the Ten Commandments are among the oldest law codes of the ancient world, they are still very relevant and very necessary today, as they ever were. Even though in many ways they offend the moral sensibilities of 21st century people, especially people living in Western liberal democracies. In this signpost, I'm going to focus on the first commandment because it's the first in order of priority, and all the others flow out of that one command. In fact, I would say that if you cannot obey you can't obey the other 9 commands at all unless you obey the first. We should also note that the 10 commandments are the very words of God. It's not Moses who is speaking, it's God who says, "You shall have no other gods before me." As a direct command from the mouth of God, we're left in no doubt that there is no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation of what is meant here. It's as simple and straightforward as can be. God alone is God, and he demands our exclusive loyalty. The first command is a fundamental requirement of human beings. An exclusive loyalty to the God who is revealed in the Bible and in the story of Israel, and supremely in the person of Jesus. Yet it's precisely at this point that modern people find so offensive. The exclusiveness of God's claim is completely contrary to the pluralism of our society. Pluralism is a pluralistic society is one where there are many religions, many faiths, and so we have this kind of idea somehow that it doesn't really matter what you believe because all roads lead to God in the end. If indeed you want to believe in a God, it doesn't really matter then which one you believe. No religion, it's thought, can make exclusive claims to being the only true religion. Furthermore, in our cultural context, the exclusivity of the Bible's claims about God offends one of the most dominant principles in our society today, namely the principle of individual autonomy. And this principle is expressed in our right to choose not only if or who to worship, but also the freedom to decide for ourselves how we shall live, unhindered by the authority of any outside agency. As one character in the movie Prometheus puts it, we are the gods now. Yet the Bible repeatedly makes exclusive claims about God, not the least in the first commandment. In John 14 verse 6, Jesus said that he was the way, the truth and the life, that no one could come to God the Father except through him. And the tense of the claim is not accidental. Jesus was making an exclusive claim about himself, that the life and truth and the way to God were only to be found in him and not in anyone else. And the disciples agreed in Acts 4 and 12. They declared that there is no other name under heaven other than the name of Jesus by which men can be saved. The Bible is very uncompromising on this issue. It declares that there is one God and that this God has the authority to direct the moral and social order of our individual lives and of our society. And furthermore, as our text today makes plain, this God must have first place in our lives. But what does that mean for Christians living in what we might call a 21st century post-God society? Well, we might think that it means not following another non-Christian religion. The 5 pillars of Islam, or the teachings of the Buddha, or New Age spirituality, or adopting an atheist worldview. So as long as we're not doing these things, then we can maybe say that we're being obedient to the first commandment, can't we? Well, actually, no. At its heart, the first commandment is about God having the place of first priority in our individual lives, and through how we live in society, first place of priority in society itself. I perhaps need to say that this has nothing to do with the rise of Christian nationalism in the USA, which is tied very much to white supremacy, militarism and the creation of a theocracy. Like a totalitarian state, a theocracy will in the end need to use coercive violence by the state in order to sustain itself. Not something that is envisaged in the Bible at all. Righteousness cannot be legislated in parliaments. It can only be demonstrated in our lives. It's as we live faithfully in obedience to God's commands, putting him as first priority in our lives, that we have a positive impact on our society, and society changes for the good of all citizens. In the end, all sin at its root is a form of idolatry. It's the result of a failure to give God his rightful place in our lives, to make him the first priority, to have no other gods before him. And that's the problem. When we sin, we've effectively put other gods before him. The basic premise is that human beings were made to worship. And when we don't worship the God of the Bible, we worship something else, even if we don't recognize it as worship. And we worship whatever takes priority of first place in our lives. The evangelist J. John is now well known for his series of talks on the Ten Commandments, and he's an interesting illustration that explains what it means to put God first in our lives, using the word first. He suggests 5 areas of our lives that this commandment relates to. He says we should put God first in our finances. In Deuteronomy 8, the people are warned not to forget God when things are going well for them. Wealth and comfort, which are so often seen as a sign of God's blessing in our lives, can actually be a hindrance to spiritual growth in a very subtle way. So an antidote to that would be to put God first in all of our financial decisions, to let our spending reflect the fact that God is first in our lives, that he is the greatest priority. It is in essence to take up Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount, not to run after the things that the pagans run after, but rather to store up our treasure in heaven. So how do we spend our money? Do we spend our money selfishly on ourselves and our own good, or do we spend it for the benefit and good of others? He suggests that we should put God first in our interests, and that would include our hobbies and how we spend our leisure time, the things that we enjoy and get excited about. I've said more than once over the years that I wish that men in the church would follow Jesus with the same passionate devotion with which they follow their football team. Too often, the reality is that we fit God around our busy lives instead of fitting our lives around him, putting him at the centre and shaping everything else, including our interests, around him. The thing is, we make time for the things that interest us. And so a lack of prayer and devotion and a life of service is a natural result of other interests having priority in our lives. And that's the very definition of idolatry. J. John says we should put God first in our relationship. And Jesus makes this very point in Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, Jesus wasn't advocating that we hate one another, but rather that in all our relationships, our relationship with him would have the priority. Although family relationships often take priority over God, one of the primary reasons that so many people have gone off the rails spiritually is because they have often placed a romantic or sexual relationship over and above the relationship with Jesus. The thing is, when our relationship with God is right, when we're putting him first in our lives, then that really helps us to be a better father, a better mother, a better son, a better daughter, a better friend, a better husband, a better wife. Putting God first in the relationship is what makes it work. He says that we should put God first in our schedule. You all know the bumper sticker, I'm sure, that says a dog is not just for Christmas, a dog is for life. Maybe we should have a bumper sticker on our cars that says that God is not just for Sundays, but for every day. Because sadly, many professing Christians cannot find the time to serve God or live for him and making God-honouring choices, but they always manage to find time for other things. Instead, what we ought to do is to begin with God and work out from there, to shape our lives around God rather than around shaping God around our lives. And lastly, J. John says we should put God first in our troubles. Everyone has troubles, problems, worries and cares. We all have troubles, and how we deal with them is really instructive about the priorities of our lives. Why is it so often that God is seen as a last resort when we're going through the hard realities of life? Yet it's often in our troubles that God has the opportunity to remind us of his glory and greatness and power. And it is often only in our troubles that we recognise our need of him. In the first commandment, God makes an exclusive claim on our loyalty and devotion. This command is the most basic of basics. And if God alone is to be first in our lives, then that excludes every other possibility. St. Augustine once said that Christ is not valued at all unless he is valued above all. Christ is not Lord at all unless he be Lord of all. It's a statement that continues to challenge us today. As we progress through the Bible from start to finish and follow the grand sweep of the story of God's salvation in Jesus, we're going to learn again and again that the heroes of that story were all men and women who sought to live out the first commandment and give God his rightful place in their lives. And it's certainly true that they did that very imperfectly. They were like us, they were all flawed individuals. But they had that basic core desire to put God first in their lives. The other side of that story is that although the people of Israel were commanded to put God first from the very moment they were constituted as the nation of Israel, their subsequent history through the rest of the First Testament is a repeated cycle of sinful rebellion against God, servitude to a foreign nation, repentance and calling for deliverance, and finally salvation, and then the cycle begins all over again. If nothing else, this teaches us that putting God first is not a one-time event, but an ongoing daily process. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul would make this point by telling the Ephesian Christians who had been all filled with the Holy Spirit in their lives to go on being filled. It also teaches us that even though we may have failed to put God first in the past or in a specific situation, we can be given that second opportunity, a further opportunity to change our priorities. Our faithfulness in putting God first in our lives in our past is important insofar as it provides the foundation that we live on today. But we shouldn't overplay our past faithfulness, because none of it will really matter if we're not being faithful today. One thing I've learned over many years trying to be a follower of Jesus is that just because I may have managed quite well to have no other gods before the one true God yesterday, that doesn't mean that I will automatically do the same today. The temptations to put other things before God are daily temptations that must be resisted. And so each day I need to intentionally seek each and every day to have no other gods before him. For he alone is God, and he alone demands and deserves my loyalty. That's the challenge and the struggle of being a disciple of Jesus, because again and again and again, temptations come and other things crowd in that would take the priority of our lives, take that first place in our lives that should belong to God alone. And it's when our lives are right before God and we live in that faithful obedience to God's commands because he is first in our lives, that we begin to have a positive impact on the people round about us and in our village, in our town, in our city, in our nation. And so every citizen is blessed. As God says through Jeremiah, we're to seek the welfare of the city, for in its welfare we'll find our own as well. And so we must struggle through our temptations and our challenges and all that our modern society bombards us with as being of most importance in our lives, and reject all that and say, actually no, God alone is God and I must have no other gods before him. And if I get that wrong, then everything else is going to be wrong. And we can actually see that, I think, being played out in our wider society. We have cast off all restraint, cast off the notion of God, cast off the moral demands that he makes upon us, and see where it's got us. People imagine that abandoning God would make heaven on earth without all the guilt and oppression of religion. The reality is that we've made a hell on earth. And the only way to fix that is to turn back to God and give him his rightful place, to acknowledge that he alone is God, and that he demands and deserves the place of first priority of our lives. Thanks for listening.